This episode is sponsored by True Recovery. If you or someone you care for is dealing with addiction, you know that finding a treatment option that works for you can be extremely frustrating. Truth is, every patient's needs are different and constantly evolving. That's why we stand behind True Recovery. Find out more about the range of services at truerecovery.com. I'm woefully aware of how few people know anything about the opioid crises in America. Opiates, opioids, and the problems they cause are in the headlines daily, but this drug's use actually started thousands of years ago. 19th century America ushered in the era of patent medicines and post-Civil War addiction. Today we are joined by Dr. David Courtwright, who has written extensively about the history of drugs. And now DrDrew.com presents The History of Opium. Part 4, Facts and Myths, Opium and Morphine Use in 19th Century America. No tongue or pen will describe the depths of horror in which life was plunged at this time. The days of humiliation and anguish, nights of terror and agony through which I dragged my wretched being. This was a quote from a Civil War soldier, not on battle, but on his opium addiction. The 19th century ushered in a widespread era of opium use. Chinese immigrants who came to America hoping to find their fortune began arriving in 1820, largely working as indentured servants. These men were far from home and far from their families. They worked at difficult jobs for many years. The challenging existence demanded the occasional release that was fulfilled by communal activity of smoking opium. This quickly became a popular pastime for others, including Americans and women, despite the fact that it served no legitimate therapeutic purpose. Eventually, opium smoking and opium dens were established in nearly every major city.
In the 19th century, in addition to the medical addicts, you also had opium smokers, and they were then divided into two groups. The white opium smokers, who were invariably members of the underworld. They were gamblers or prostitutes and so on. Or you had the Chinese opium smokers, who were basically indentured immigrants who had come to the United States, and they worked in the mines and they worked on the railroads, and they recreated in Chinatowns, as they were called in the 19th century, and where there were all these bachelor vices like gambling and prostitution and opium smoking. Some significant percentage, probably 15, 20%, something like that, of the Chinese laborers became regular smokers. And the general opinion was that this was a vice, and that both the white opium smokers and the Chinese opium smokers were morally culpable. There was a clear distinction, just absolutely crystal clear, that the medical addicts were people in pain who had become addicted through self-medication or, more typically, physicians' administration of morphine, whereas these other people had brought it on themselves. They had visited an opium den, or they were indulging in vice, and there was no sympathy. And that was true in the general population, and it was true in the American medical profession. There was a sharp moral distinction between the two sorts of addicts.
During the same time period, the phenomenon of patent medicine, so-called, took the country by storm. A spate of proprietary, quote, cures promising to treat a broad range of maladies was sold by just about anyone who was interested in developing his own concoction.
One of the more interesting patent medicines I discovered in my research in the 19th century was something called Scotch Oats Essence. And what made it so interesting is the backstory. There was a young man with his eye on the main chance, and he offhandedly asked the doctor, how do I succeed in the patent medicine business? The doctor said, well, take some whiskey and put in an opiate and disguise the whole thing with a bitter tincture, and then advertise it like crazy, and you'll have a success. And he went out and did it, and sure enough, that's what happened. He made a fortune until it was discovered that he included morphine in the medication, and then he was disgraced and ultimately went bankrupt, which was actually quite a common story for 19th century patent medicines. Another interesting category of patent medicines would have been the opium habit cures. So there were patent medicines with names like Opacura or Dinarco, which were aimed at people who were addicted to opiates. And basically it was a disguised form of maintenance, because invariably these patent medicines contained morphine. And so people would think that they were off the habit when in fact they were just maintaining it. Some of them were semi-legitimate in the sense that they were aimed at gradual reduction. So you have somebody who starts off taking a bottle that has maybe 30 or 40 grains of morphine in the bottle, and then they gradually reduce the dosage, bottle 1, bottle 2, bottle 3, bottle 4, so that by the time you get to the 8th or 9th bottle, you've been weaned from the morphine. So I guess you have to say those weren't completely fraudulent.
The so-called remedies typically contain large amounts of alcohol, laudanum, morphine, along with a host of other mysterious ingredients. Most of these products were not actually patented, nor were they subject to any regulation. This meant that ingredients and amounts used were undisclosed. Predictably, their administration often led to tragic results. Dosing babies with potent nostrums promised to cure colic. This resulted in many unintended infant deaths. In spite of the inherent risks, patent medicines was big business. Mothers who often served as their family's primary healthcare provider feared contraction of serious diseases like cholera, typhoid, and typhus, and they endeavored to keep them off with these so-called miracle cures.
During my research, I uncovered a number of cookbooks that had recipes for opiates, and this surprised me. I got into this because I was interested in self-medication. Most of the addicts in the 19th century were medical addicts. Most of them were created by doctors, but not all of them. So the question was, all right, how did some people become addicted through self-medication? And one of the discoveries I made is that people would include recipes for treatments, for example, for diarrhea in their cookbooks. And so you come across a Texas Pioneer Woman's cookbook, and it would say in the back, along with the beans recipes and the pork recipes, it would say, take brandy, cloves, cinnamon, camphor, and laudanum, mix it up, and use to treat diarrhea. Although I will say that I'm not entirely sure that was a bad thing. I doubt that this frequently led to addiction when mothers were treating their children for occasional aches and pains with these sort of polypharmaceutical recipes. A far more prolific source of addiction in the 19th century was morphine injection, and that was something you were usually introduced to by physicians, not from your mother's cookbook.
The near constant threats of mortality greatly contributed to the explosion of patent medicine business, and the ignorance about the contents of these tonics put multitudes of people in peril. You have to remember, in the post-war era, there were major outbreaks of infectious diseases, lots of child and infant death. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Walcott's instant pain annihilator, and Dr. Kilmer's ocean weed heart remedy are just a few of the countless products that were available to the consumer, mostly snake oil. And an air of respectability was provided by way of a physician's association or because it was marketed as a trustworthy family remedy. The false sense of security that these quack medicines evoked made people, particularly the underclasses, it made them extremely vulnerable to the outrageous claims. These purveyors of these potions preyed upon the fears of women and blatantly lied about the curative powers of the products. Shameless exploitation of consumers, gullibility, responsible for much of the narcotic use and abuse that occurred in the 1800s, growing concerns about the highly questionable products led the New York Medical Society to form a committee to study them in 1827. The word addiction was not yet part of the vernacular, but the phenomenon was increasingly understood. So we arrive at a pivotal point in history, which often been credited with the genesis of the 19th century opium morphine epidemic. Of course, we're talking about the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And many historians have attributed a high rate of opium abuse to the bloodiest of the American wars and its aftermath particularly. But a deeper and more thorough examination of the data has led modern scholars to suggest that there were other things afoot.
It's certainly true that a number of Civil War veterans became morphine addicts or opium addicts. I mean, I've read their autobiographies. There are people who ended up in Andersonville, the notorious prison camp, who left with chronic headaches and racking stomach pains, and they sought out medical assistance. They were given morphine. They became addicted. The problem I have as an historian is that the surveys of opium and morphine addiction in the late 19th century consistently show that 60 to 80% of the addicts were female. And the implication of that is that while the Civil War may have been a factor, it could not have been the primary factor, because majority of the users were female. And in other research I've done, I've noticed that quite a few Civil War veterans drank. So that's something that people forget, is that there are other kinds of addiction. And I would say that the primary drug that veterans resorted to after the war was alcohol, not opiates.
The opium was dispensed in large amounts during the Civil War. That's undisputed. The Union Army physicians alone distributed nearly 10 million opium pills, close to 3 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures, all to its soldiers for any number of ailments. The instant benefit to soldiers who were in pain far outweighed any long-term consequences that might come from overuse, so well-meaning wartime physicians, who had an average of 2 years of medical training, eagerly provided relief to the suffering. These drugs were widely available and given out freely, but unfortunately, Army doctors were largely treating symptoms rather than causes of the problems. Soldiers took opiates to treat everything from diarrhea to battlefield injuries. One Union surgeon by the name of Nathan Meyer, who famously made diagnoses from horseback, would pour out an exact quantity of powder after assessing the patient's condition and let him lick it from his hand. Opium powders were sprinkled directly into wounds to manage pain. While it's true that these medications were issued liberally, and the practice undoubtedly resulted in many cases of dependency, there is a good deal of evidence to suggest that the Civil War was not the largest contributor to opiate abuse during that period. For starters, a landmark study, The Opium Problem, 1928, Charles Terry, an early campaigner against drug addiction, and his wife, Mildred Pellins, determined that the majority of the opium addicts in the 19th century were actually affluent, educated women who were given morphine prescriptions for ambiguous conditions like so-called hysteria and melancholy. In other words, they were using opium and opium products to treat mental illness. It's estimated that at one time, 60% of addicts were women. One popular statistic is that 400,000 soldiers were addicted after the war, but this has been scrutinized in recent years. One expert asserts that army disease, or soldier's disease, which has widely been interpreted to mean opium addiction, was popularized by historians who were maybe mistaken. They state that perhaps the actual condition referred to in large number of soldiers was malaria, dysentery, typhoid, post-traumatic stress disorder, other things. The critics of the long-standing theory also argue that the hypodermic needle was introduced too late. It came to America in 1856 to make much of a difference during the war, though it certainly did after the war. Medical records show there were 2,093 needles for the 11,000 Union doctors, and even less for the Confederate physicians. So scholars claim that the scarcity of needles to inject morphine would have prevented the creation of so many addicts, at least parenteral addicts, during the war. By 1881, most doctors were using hypodermic needles, and because the frequency of visiting patients often hampered by long travels on horseback, doctors were largely inclined to leave a needle and a vial of medicine to be used by the patient during the interim. The practice could certainly facilitate unchecked abuse. David Courtwright, who is recognized as an expert in the history of opium addiction, summarizes what the invention of the hypodermic needle meant to physicians and patients. Quote, "For the first time in the entire history of medicine, near instantaneous symptomatic relief for a wide range of diseases was possible. A syringe of morphine was, in a very real sense, a magic wand." Unquote. And I have to tell you, this is something that physicians in training and even other physicians, seasoned physicians, fall victim to today. We want to help, we want to stop suffering, and this does do that in the short term. That's how we get seduced. This development obviously had a significant impact on patients who were in pain, but it also had a profound effect on doctors, right? For the first time, they were able to relieve suffering, and relatively harmlessly, right? Morphine sulfate did not harm the patient, unless they really appreciated the potential for addiction. In addition to a thorough re-examination of the historical record, anecdotal evidence about the lack of opium abuse is provided by Walt Whitman. Whitman, who visited 80,000 to 100,000 patients in over 600 hospitals during the Civil War, wrote of the soldiers wanting items like tobacco or candy, but never mentioning addiction. Now, no one disputes that the Civil War was rife with opium abuse, but we're starting to understand that what probably happened was the trauma of opium abuse and the availability of the hypodermic syringe is what fueled the epidemic that followed. Post-war addiction, no doubt, educated American women were certainly victimized. They're an important population in this epidemic. Prior to living in the White House, Mary Todd Lincoln suffered from migraine headaches. For this condition, she took paregoric or laudanum. When she became First Lady, however, she had access to better medical care, which meant prescriptions for morphine. And there's some reason to believe that this resulted in a dependence and may have affected the course of her mental health, which was not good. It should come as no surprise that her habit reached quite elevated heights after her husband's assassination. And it was her son, Frank, that actually had her committed to a psychiatric state hospital. After slavery was abolished, many white Southerners were wiped out financially and turned to drug use as a way to deal with the trauma. On the contrary, African Americans were less inclined to partake because the Confederacy's defeat was a cause for happiness and celebration. Between 1860 and 1880, opium became a national crisis. It was thought that physical dependency could result from continuous use over a period of 10 to 14 days. Beginning in the 1870s, the professional community began to recognize the possibility of iatrogenic morphine addiction, that is to say, caused by doctors, caused by the medical system. And discussion about the phenomenon began to appear in books, journal articles, and public speeches. In 1892, the Journal of the American Medical Association called for a ban on imports of smoking opium. The actions did not come soon enough. In 1874, a London chemist by the name of Courtwright boiled morphine to synthesize yet another potent derivative called diacetylmorphine. Substance was later refined by Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, and sold under the name, as a cough suppressant, the name of heroin. This product also claimed to be a cure for many other things. The opium epidemic reached its peak in 1895. It had become quite clear that overprescribing physicians were primarily to blame for the situation. Quote, by this time it was standard practice to replace one addictive drug with another, which only enabled the addict to continue down the path of abuse. This is something we do this day. Also in play during this period is the process of withdrawal, whose symptoms mimic other illnesses and generally result in more opium-based prescriptions. Educating doctors was now the key to turning things around. And the concept of addiction, derived from the Latin root addicere, meaning to adore or surrender oneself to a master, would begin to enter the lexicon of professional literature in the mid-1890s. Be sure to check out Dr. Courtwright's upcoming book, The Age of Addiction, How Bad Habits Became Big Business, in which he expands his exploration of addiction to include those associated with food and the digital realm. His book will be published by Harvard University Press and available in May of 2019. I want to thank our staff at Doctor.com, particularly Michelle Poe, for pulling this Opium series together. Read the entire series and all our weekly medical articles at drdrew.com, and be sure to join our email list at drdrew.com/contact, and please do tell a friend. We hope you've enjoyed this chapter of the history of opium, which is sponsored by True Recovery. If you or someone you care for is dealing with addiction, you know that finding a treatment option that works for you can be quite frustrating. Truth is, every patient's needs are different and they are evolving. People behind True Recovery in Orange County, California realize that effective care cannot be a one-size-fits-all. That's why they've developed a comprehensive range of treatments that addresses all the needs of a drug addict and alcoholic, and as well as co-occurring disorders. True Recovery's master-level clinicians maintain small caseloads, allowing them to truly personalize their care. They offer individualized treatment plans from residential to outpatient, always with a holistic approach and a focus on accountability. As the patients become ready, True Recovery offers assistance with life and coping skills, school and vocational coordination, as well as community reintegration support, a critical piece that's often missed by many programs, getting people back to work and back to living. I've spoken with True Recovery's medical director, and I was impressed with the range of therapeutic modalities and psychiatric services. Their experienced team is well equipped to manage patients at all levels of care. To request more information on how True Recovery can provide you personalized care, go to drdrew.com/true. Again, that is drdrew.com/TRUE. We'll see you next week.